For Cynthia Powell, the Beatles' trip to Hamburg was anything but a reason to celebrate. Certainly, she believed, the pleasures of the Reeperbahn would make her seem provincial and inadequate. She was already learning to stave off the flirtatious Liverpool girls who were after John, but with Hamburg's reputation for loose women, she was sure their relationship wouldn't endure the separation. Cynthia tried to make the best of it, reassuring herself that they were scheduled to be gone for only 6 weeks. In the end, it turned out that they stayed for over 5 months. A compulsive doodler and letter writer, John's missives arrived almost daily. The envelope would be covered with kisses and verses of love.
Postman, postman, don't be slow. I'm in love with Cynthia, so go man go.
Inside, there would be 30-page handwritten epic accounts of his adventures, complete with cartoon drawings. The Beatles had set off from the Jacaranda in a dilapidated cream and green minibus along with Alan Williams, his wife Beryl, his brother-in-law Barry Chang, and his West Indian friend, Lord Woodbine. In the band's suitcases were new costumes of black crewneck sweaters and short houndstooth jackets, for which Alan Williams had advanced them 15 pounds each. The trip was long, and the van broke down. At a stop in Arnhem, Holland, John shoplifted a harmonica and added it to their act. The letters describing Hamburg made it sound as if John wouldn't need any help from his vivid imagination to improve upon the bizarre reality. They were playing not in the Kaiserkeller but in a dreary little dive called the Indra Club, with a neon sign in the shape of an elephant outside the front door. The Indra's tiny stage usually featured strippers and sex shows, and the regular customers, a cross-section of the Reeperbahn's underbelly, including gun-toting gangsters, drug pushers, and transvestites, who weren't very happy to find a group of oddly dressed English boys on the stage instead of nude female mud wrestlers. The Beatles were expected to entertain from 7 in the evening until 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes 7 nights a week.
Everything else was such a buzz, being right in the middle of the naughtiest city in the world at 17 years old. It was kind of exciting. And learning, about, well, there's all the gangsters, and there's the transvestites, and there's the, it was like that, there's the hookers.
The club's owner, Bruno Koschmider, was obligated to give them a place to live and put them up in the basement of a cinema he also owned called the Bambino. The boys were given 3 dirty cubby holes at the front of the theater, just behind the screen. The cinema alternated adult films with gangster movies, and it wasn't unusual for the boys to be awakened in the early afternoon by the sounds of fevered panting. The rooms were literally holes, and it wasn't unusual for the boys to find human excrement under a newspaper if one was brave enough to find one. Only at Alan Williams's insistence were they given clean blankets and bedding. No towels were provided, however, and the only toilet was the public one at the rear of the theater. 5 months went by with the boys hardly taking more than a sponge bath. Their meals consisted of a bowl of cornflakes and milk when they arose in the afternoon, and an occasional dinner at the Seamen's Mission, where Williams had taken pity on them and was feeding them at cut-rate seamen's prices. At the Indra, the dressing room was also the men's toilets, and the attendant, an old lady in ankle socks named Rosa, was happy to sell them a prodigious supply of the German-made diet pills called Preludin, which she kept in a candy jar. Except for Pete Best, who seemed to disassociate himself from all their wildness, the Beatles quickly found they needed the Prellies to keep them going through the long nights of non-stop playing. The Prellies made them thirsty, which in turn made them drink more beer, which was free and plentiful from the barmaids, when Koschmider wasn't looking. Also, it became quite common for customers to send drinks up to the stage to get them drunk. The audiences came to be entertained, so when Koschmider yelled "Mach Schau" at them, make sure they did.
And I think the other thing about Hamburg was that it was your first really professional thing, because you actually had to attract people in. I always think that was one of the most important things. We'd be playing, and there'd be hardly anyone in the club, and you'd see a couple of sort of young people, like a young couple, just look in, and they'd first of all look at the price of the beer, and you'd sort of see them go, no, and they'd go out. So we started to know, God, the beer's too expensive. And so when they ducked in next time, we go, well, what'd I say? Yo, come on, yeah, really come on in.
Their nervous systems were electrified by the cheap amphetamines, and their inhibitions were demolished by the beer and booze. They were capable of anything on stage. John, in particular, would bring down the house with his speed-induced imitation of cripples and goblins. He would jump, crawl, and scream, sometimes taunting the audience by calling them Nazis. The audiences, usually at least as drunk or high as they were, only laughed, cheered, and egged them on to be even more outrageous.
John was aggressive, very aggressive, and outrageous on stage. Paul, his personality was, if he hadn't been a rock and roll singer, he would have made a good public relations man. Whenever there was any problems, he was the one who would pour water over the troubled waters they experienced. He would smooth everything out. And now we come to George. George was the quiet. He was like the baby of the group. He had no control over the band. The band was dominated by John and Paul, and George had to go along with it.
John was so out of control one night that when a customer overenthusiastically approached the stage, John kicked him in the head twice, then grabbed a steak knife from a table and threw it at the man. The Beatles' favorite part of the St. Pauli district was the incredible fenced-in red light area. Considering how young they were, John and Stu were 20, Paul was 18, and George was only 17. The Herberstrasse was like a sexual Disneyland. Here, all hours of the day and night, waited streetwalkers of every size, shape, and description, sitting in the parlor windows facing the narrow street, reading, arguing, and gossiping with tradesmen. This is not to say the boys had to pay for their sex very often. Cute, young, and randy, they had any number of women available to them for free, from the barmaids to the customers. More than once, they had a knee trembler, with some sweet young thing in a doorway, only to discover her the next day sitting in the window of a house in the Herberstrasse. Screwed, blued, and tattooed, stoned any time of the day or night, the Beatles became a walking laboratory of venereal diseases. During his short stay in Hamburg, Alan Williams became the self-appointed little pox doctor. The boys would come to him at Gretel and Alphonse, a small bar where they would spend their off hours, and ask him to step into the back room for a spot examination. Williams also taught them a witch doctor's method of diagnosis by holding their urine up to the light in a beer glass. The public health facilities in Hamburg were free and more accommodating, and the boys were cured, and stricken at an alarming rate. Koschmider extended the Beatles' engagement, and after dispatching an exhausted and dissipated Darien the seniors back to Liverpool, he moved the Beatles to his big club, the Kaiserkeller. The Kaiserkeller was enormous compared to the Indra, with an incongruous nautical decor of portholes and fishnets. The Kaiser was also much rougher than the Indra, and the club had its own highly efficient squad of bouncers. This small army, frequently called into service in the Violent Club, was headed by an ex-boxer named Horst Farscher, who allegedly had spent time in jail for killing a sailor with his fists in a street brawl. Fortunately, Farscher took the Liverpool boys to heart, particularly John, and as Kaiserkeller employees, they were put under his special protection. With Farscher acting as godfather, they felt invulnerable, and their provocative behavior increased accordingly. One night, smashed on Prelies and beer, they tried to roll an English sailor who got drunk at the bar, but they only had the heart to hit him twice before giving up. When Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were also booked into the Kaiserkeller, a contest ensued as to who could stomp a hole first in the riding stage. Rory won, and was fated with a case of cheap champagne. When Koschmider heard about the contest, he dispatched a contingent of thugs to rough up the two bands. The Liverpool groups joined forces, and armed with chairs and table legs, managed to emerge with no broken bones.
And that's where I met the Beatles. It ended up that we both played the same club in Germany, the Beatles and Rory, so besides one night we smashed up the stage between us because it was heavy competition. There'd be a lot of rivalry going on. I'd end up, if they had the last set, I'd be sitting there saying, play so-and-so, which is like this slow songs all the time.
By the next day's performance, a truce had been called, and life went on as usual. Summer quickly turned into autumn, and the boys' engagement was extended yet again. In Liverpool, Cynthia waited patiently. John's letters now talked about a beautiful girl named Astrid Kirchner and her roommate, Klaus Voormann. As the story unfolded, bit by bit, Astrid and Klaus seemed to be having a tremendous effect on the boys. Klaus, a Berlin-born doctor's son, was an art student in Hamburg. One night, after an argument with Astrid, he stumbled into the Kaiserkeller. He was astonished to find the Beatles, with their funny-looking checkered jackets and wavy pompadours. He was particularly taken by Stu, hiding behind those mysterious clip-on dark glasses and moodily playing his bass guitar. 2 nights later, Klaus asked Astrid to come with him to see them, and then the next night and the next, and soon Astrid was hooked on them herself.
They were so individual, every one of them. It was a photographer's dream. It's very strange, and maybe it sounds sort of sentimental, but when I saw him for the first time, I knew that was my man. You know, he was and still is the love of my life.
Astrid was an exotically pretty girl with a blonde pixie haircut and large dark eyes. When she met the boys, she was a photographic assistant, and Klaus was living in a room on the top floor of her mother's house. Astrid was enchanted with these peculiar English boys, and despite the language barrier, she managed to strike up a friendship with them. The boys, in return, were delighted to meet some local people their own age. It wasn't long before the Beatles started wearing leather trousers and tunics, some of which Astrid designed and made for them herself. John seemed so in awe of Astrid that Cynthia was certain this was the one who would steal his heart away. But only 2 months after her name first appeared in John's letters, he wrote that Astrid had become engaged to Stu. Although they hardly knew 25 words to say to each other, they chipped in and bought engagement rings. Stu intended to live in Germany with her after they were married. Quite a change had come over Stu too. Astrid was now making all his clothes, including a collarless sports jacket similar to the ones Pierre Cardin had popularized in Paris. Astrid had also talked Stu into combing his hair forward over his forehead and cutting it into bowl-shaped bangs. One by one, except for Pete Best, the other boys soon followed suit, and the Beatle haircut was born. As their 5th month in Hamburg approached, Cynthia wondered if the boys would ever come home. From the way it sounded in John's letters, they might have stayed right through the next year if they hadn't been thrown out by the police. The trouble began when a new club, the Top 10, opened on the site of the old Hippodrome Club, and its owner, Peter Eckhorn, started luring employees away from the other Reeperbahn clubs. The Kaiserkeller's famed bouncer, Horst Fascher, had already defected with some of his best men, as had Rosa, the lady in the washroom who sold the Beatles Prellies. The Beatles would have gone to the Top 10 too, if Koschmider hadn't pointed out a clause in their contracts forbidding them to take employment within 30 weeks and 25 miles of their employment at the Kaiserkeller. In fact, Koschmider let it be known that if the boys played at the Top 10 club, it wouldn't be safe for them to walk within 25 miles of the Kaiserkeller. Nevertheless, by early December, as their contracts with Koschmider ran out, the boys moved into accommodations provided by Peter Eckhorn and were seen on stage at the Top 10 club. Word quickly filtered back to Koschmider. The following day, the boys were dragged out of bed by several very unpleasant policemen from the Reeperbahn station house who were searching for George Harrison. Koschmider had tipped them off that George was not yet 18 and therefore forbidden by law to be in any club on the Reeperbahn past curfew. In fact, the police discovered that none of the band members had legal permission to be working. George was ordered to pack and leave the country within 24 hours. Stu and Astrid took him to the train station in her car that night. In an unusual show of emotion for him, he choked back tears when he hugged them tightly on the train platform. Then he got on the train with his guitar under his arm and a bag of apples and biscuits that Astrid had fixed for him and went sorrowfully off to Liverpool. A few days later, Paul and Pete Best went back to the Bambino, where they had left behind a few of their meager belongings. They had expected Koschmider to have thrown their things out, but everything was just where they left it behind the cinema screen. Not smart enough to let well enough alone, an unfortunate bit of mischief occurred on the way out of the theater. Paul unfurled a condom and lit it with a match. The dry drapes hanging on the walls of the theater quickly began to smolder, and Paul and Pete hightailed it out of the theater without stopping to mention that it might burn down. The fire was discovered and put out before much damage was done, but the suspicious origin was investigated by authorities, who found some rather incriminating evidence on the ceiling of the room where the fire started, written in carbon with the flame of a candle, the name Beatles. The next morning, the police were back, this time with arson detectives who escorted Pete and Paul down to the Reeperbahn police station, where they were held and interrogated for several hours on suspicion of trying to burn down the Bambino. Thanks to an undeserved kindness on Koschmider's part, no charges were filed, but the boys were ordered out of the country. Paul and Pete found themselves on the next flight to England without Pete's drums or most of their luggage. John and Stu were now the only ones left, and there wasn't much reason for John to remain in Hamburg. John returned home the cheapest way, by train, defeated and depressed, looking forward to Cynthia, a warm bath, and even Aunt Mimi. Stu, who had a touch of tonsillitis and a fever, was sent home by plane, his airfare scraped together by his concerned fiancée. He was expected to return to Hamburg in a few months to marry her.
When I got back when we were deported from Hamburg, first George was deported, and then Paul, and I was the only one old enough to stay there, and I was working with the house band for another month or so after the others had left. This is an old story. Now then finally, I was deported too, and I came home from Hamburg on my own on the train through Holland. It was pretty scary, and I thought, well, I did it, I got home, I didn't call the other Beatles for 3 weeks. And they were mad at me because I hadn't called them. But I was thinking about things,
The 5 young men who returned to Liverpool that Christmas were so discouraged they didn't even bother to speak to each other for weeks after they returned. Paul took a job working on a delivery truck for £7 a week to earn some extra money for Christmas, and John stayed in bed all day, trying to escape the grim reality of being in Mendips again. It was a few nights before Christmas 1960 that they set up their instruments at the Casbah and played together for the first time since coming home. The audience in the Casbah was thunderstruck. A remarkable transformation had occurred in Hamburg.
The music started, and the whole dance floor just moved basically down to the front of the stage and just stood there mesmerized, and then all of a sudden there were just these screams from the girls in the audience.
Those long nightly hours of playing had paid off in the most unexpected way: professionalism. Although they were still unorganized and casual on stage, they were no longer the bum group that had left Liverpool 5 months before. They were now a slick entertainment act, full of confidence and stage presence. In particular, they were visually like no other group in town. Their clothing was now an unaccountable mixture of leather pants, cowboy boots, and denim jackets. Their hairstyles featured feminine bangs combed over their foreheads.
It was Hamburg that had done it. It was only back in Liverpool that we realized the difference and saw what was happening.
What was happening was an instant snowballing of popularity as word spread about the new and improved Beatles back from Hamburg. Within a month, they were recommended for a job at the Cavern Club on Matthew Street. The Cavern was exactly what it sounded like: a slimy subterranean cavern beneath a converted warehouse in the downtown business district. No matter to the Beatles, at £20 a week a day each, they were ecstatic to be there. A steady lunchtime gig in a crowded club was exactly what the boys needed to build a following. Soon, they would become the Cavern's house band.
If it hadn't been for Hamburg, there would be no Beatles. The work there was so fantastically hard. And people say to me, Alan, tell us the secret of how to be a Beatle. I say, go to Germany for 6 months, work 7 nights a week, 8 hours a night, and then come back and ask you the same question.